Hey guys, today we're going to talk about the faction of Vlandia in Mountain Blade Bannerlord, and more specifically, the different types of units you can acquire and upgrade throughout the game. If you're used to watching my For Honor Realism analysis, it's going to be a bit different to that. Before I explain that though, this is going to be a double upload today, so that means I'm also going to release my Gladiator Realism analysis as well. If that interests you, go ahead and check that out. Back to what I was originally saying though, this is going to be a bit different from For Honor Realism analysis, as the only thing I can really inspect, and what's only really worth inspecting to be honest, would be the armor along with some weapons. Also, since there are so many Vlandian based armors and weapons, I'm only focusing on that which is already worn by the troops. This will hopefully help simplify it so that way the video isn't 3 parts and 30 minutes each. Finally, unlike my For Honor videos where I try to judge something based not just off of its historical factor, but its real-world practicality as well, in this game I really don't need to do that. This game for the most part is so true to its historical counterparts in that almost every case it has merit to actually being practical in real life because it has been used in real life. As for the game itself, if you like videos like this, then most likely you already know about Mountain Blade series, but if you don't, then I highly suggest checking it out. I've been having a blast playing it, although it does start to chug quite a bit when it gets to larger battles, as you might see in the background footage. It is an early access game and it might show from time to time. So how troops work in this game is through a bracket upgrade system. All troops start from the Vlandian recruit and then upgrade to various other troops from there. So let's talk about the recruit first and then we'll move our way up from there as we go. So in talking about these units, you'll begin to see that they all roughly try to share a similar basis of what time frame these armors and such would originate from, which is sometime between the 11th and 12th century for the most part. What I mean by that is you're not going to have a troop that looks like a 15th century knight while another one looks like a 10th century man-at-arms. I commend them for how well they did while still making an entertaining game, but there are still some discrepancies that I'll address further in the video. When talking about the recruit specifically though, there are a few inconsistencies. Fair warning beforehand, this video will be completely nitpicky. They did a fantastic job with this game. There's even more work that they have planned with it. I'm merely comparing history with the in-game models because people find it entertaining. Now, when looking at the recruit for face value, it's pretty well done. We have an arming cap, a basic tunic, and then they wield a spear, which is the most basic a weapon could get for a peasant. All that is fantastic. But if we want to be really nitpicky, which is why I exist, we can continue to notice a few things that don't really make sense. For starters, the really tall boots like that weren't really a thing between the 11th and 12th century. Turn shoes were more popular for a form of footwear due to how easy they were to make and how little resources they require. It's especially important for someone who could be considered poor for the time. One thing that really points out that this troop is poor is the fact that they're using a rope to tie down their tunic. Now, not to say that it can't be done or even wasn't done, but it's much more common for someone to own a full leather belt to attach to their waist instead of being forced to use a rope. Especially considering how much leather it would have cost to make those boots, you would think that they would just get a belt first and foremost. Besides all of that, this looks pretty good imitating what a peasant would look like. I would also like to note that their clothing changes color too based off of the faction they're associated with. My faction color happened to be brown, but let it be known that medieval clothing happened to be very colorful in some cases and not as dreary as this color looks. Let's move down the Crossbowmen upgrade line and we can come back to Infantrymen when we are finished. Next, we have the Vlandian Levy Crossbowmen, and this is a very big jump from what we had before. So now, the arming cap is padded for extra protection, the rope that ties around the waist is much thicker, which is nice, but it's not a belt, which is strange in my opinion. There's also some large leather gloves, which are a bit too large in my opinion, covering almost the entirety of the forearm. Most importantly, out of all of them though, would have to be the addition of a sword. Now, adding a sword is fine, but the sword they give this troop is so nice that it really stands out. The scabbard in particular is really well done and in my opinion seems out of place. That being said, there aren't a lot of surviving scabbards to disprove that they didn't all have this high quality, so it's really hard to say. One thing that I will commend them for is the fact that the sword is on the left and the quiver is on the right side of the hip and not on the back. They do this for normal archers as well. This is how it's meant to be, especially for a crossbowman on the move in a battlefield. It's much easier than fumbling with the quiver on the back. Next, we have the Vlandian Crossbowmen, and again, we have a lot of new improvements. For starters, he has a belt now. Yay, round of applause. It's an interesting choice of belt because he has also across the chest strap, but more importantly is how the belt is attached from the front. Not just does it have a belt buckle, but it also wraps the excess around the front. Usually when people try to do a recreation, they pick one or the other, but the right answer is that they used both. Buckles like that were used, but so was wrapping around the excess length. Also, the first true armor piece is shown, and it's a kettle helm with an arming cap. The kettle hat, or helms, or however you'd like to call them, aren't really a part of the 11th century as far as I could tell from reading a few sources, but considering how the armor pieces of these troops will take inspiration from the 12th and even a little bit of the 13th century as well, you'll see that they all tend to meld together and still make somewhat believable sets of armor. Next, we have the Vlandian hardened crossbowmen, and this one is really interesting to me. For starters, those big bulky leather gloves are gone and replace what looks like padded bracers. See, something like this makes more sense to me, especially since if this were a normal archer with a longbow, then he would need some sort of forearm protection like this. This is also better now because his fingers are free to manipulate the bowstring however he needs. It also probably costs less since you don't use that much leather, and it probably protects the user better just due to how well quilted fabric works as an armor. Also, to address the elephant in the room, he now has a chainmail hauberk. It looks good to me, and it fits that of a soldier from the 11th century. This brings me back to the kettle helm of the late 12th century to early 13th century being paired with this, and how this is still reasonable even though this type of helmet would pair better with a full sleeve mail like we would see in the Morgan Bible. He also has a new belt that is much larger and is of a much higher status, I suppose you could say. It now has some sort of stamping or something to show how high quality it is. Don't know if you'd want to be wearing a belt like this into combat, as it seems something that you'd want to show off with a nice tunic, but hey, what do I know? One last thing to bring up is the shield that this troop uses, and that is the Pavis shield. To be honest, I didn't know much about this shield until I started researching for this video. Now, this shield is specifically used for crossbowmen due to this almost tombstone design in mind. That is because it's meant to be set down like a deployable barricade so that the crossbowmen can also reload while taking cover from incoming projectiles. That's why this shield has an awkward flat bottom to it. Unfortunately, in game we can't use these shields as barricades, but hopefully they add this option in the future, as that would make getting the crossbowmen as a troop much more reliable in my opinion. As for the shield itself, this is one of the few cases we find a piece of equipment that is outside the proper time correlation. These types of Pavis shields are used actually from the 14th century to the 16th century, much further from the scope that we have set with these troops. I still think it's a great choice with the crossbowmen though, and I think it really helps them stand out when you see them on the battlefield. Lastly, we have the final tier of crossbowmen known as the Vlandian Sharpshooter. Here we have another type of kettle helm with a much smaller brim. We also have what I originally thought was a padded vest, but according to the game it is a banded leather over mail, whatever that means. I can't see a vest of leather strips being that much more helpful as armor, especially as it seems to be very pliable and it's not as hardened as boiled leather or some other form of a leather armor would be. Last thing I'd like to point out is that he has mail mittens on, which is an odd choice in my opinion for someone who need to manipulate a crossbow. I haven't shot a crossbow, let alone with mittens on, so I don't know if it would make it more difficult or not. Also, if you look closely you can see he's wearing what looks like chainmail boots? I say boots because if they're chainmail chosses, then you'd see that it'd go all the way up the thigh, while it looks like these ones stop below the knee. Oddly enough, they label these as chosses, but then label another pair without the wrapping and the same size as boots. Regardless, I appreciate both the mail mittens and chosses being represented in video games, as it's such a vital piece of armor that seems to always be overlooked in video games and Hollywood adaptations of history. Now we're going to go back to the top of the bracket and move down the infantry line, starting with the Vlandian footmen. Very similar to the recruit, the only real difference here is that they have what seems to be a padded leather arming cap, a sword, and some sort of leather bracers. Leather bracers haven't really made much sense for armor when it comes to close quarters combat, but maybe it could work if they were some form of hardened leather, but I doubt they were in this case. Besides that, this is just as good as the recruit in my opinion. It breaks off into two separate upgrades, so let's talk about the spearmen upgrade first, and then we'll move on to the infantryman upgrade next. For the Vlandian spearmen, I think they did really well to portray a poor man at arms. Enough to get the equipment to protect themselves, but not enough to get some dedicated mail armor. To start, we see our first instance of the servalier, or also known as a skull cap. This is the most basic form of helmet, which is just basically a big metal bowl that protects your head. I think that this is a great choice for a starting infantry troop. We also see the padded mittens again, which is great, a kite shield on the back as well, which is really great. Finally, something that I think is okay, but we're still going to have to be nitpicky about it again. The gambeson vest. I don't know if gambeson vests were much of a thing in the Middle Ages, as it just makes sense to attach some sleeves on it, as it's basically almost a finished jacket anyways. Besides that though, one thing that really stood out to me is the addition of leather straps and buckles to fasten the gambeson clothes. Now, most people don't realize just due to how easy it is to make metal nowadays and how easy leather is to come by, but making a bunch of buckles and straps just to keep a jacket closed is a bit excessive, especially considering that just lacing them closed with some sort of string would do the same job as well, if not better. I know it's a small thing to talk about, but I think it's interesting nonetheless. Next, we're moving on to the Vlandian billmen, and these just keep getting better and better as we move along. Now we have a nasal helm, and let me just say they did an absolutely amazing job at recreating these. They even have the flared off tip on the nose guard and a very conical top like those of the Nordmann helms too. Just overall a really great job on that helmet, and as for the rest, it's also pretty good. If the mail were to be shown going up to the thighs as well, then that would be very similar to the depictions that we see of the Bayeux tapestry. Moving on, we'll talk about the Vlandian pikemen first. For starters, we have what looks like some sort of visored Spangen helm, which could possibly be the predecessor for what becomes the enclosed helm. More on that later. I think the design looks great and it goes really well with the rest of the design. We have full mail encompassing the entire body, including the hands. This type of armor design is what we would see in the 12th century moving on to the 13th. I think that this just overall looks badass, especially with how well they made the texture of the mail look and how the weight of the hauberk is being slightly picked up by the waist belt. I can tell that the developer Tailworlds put some serious research in their game, and I hope that they know it is being fully appreciated. The only problem that I could possibly say is that they aren't wearing chainmail on their calves and on their feet like we saw with the chainmail Chosis, but I believe that's due to this being a heavy armor troop, and stats wise the splint boots that he's wearing are actually stronger than the chainmail boots, even though these splint boots don't actually protect the feet themselves. Gameplay logic, I suppose, but again, I doubt anyone other than me would find something as trivial as that, so I say they still did great regardless. On the second upgrade, we have the Vlandian volgier. This is interesting as we saw previously that the pikeman and his chainmail mittens go underneath his hauberk, and now we have one where they're going over. I personally think that it could have been possible either way, and in some cases the mittens were actually integral to the hauberk. In this case, we have a surcoat over the mail, which is fantastic. We can see that the surcoat has a split in the middle, making sitting and riding a horse much easier as well. Great attention to detail. We also have another type of kettle helm, another one of those cases where it's a much later version of kettle helms that kind of escape the 11th to 12th century theme a bit. Last but not least for this troop, the Volg, or however you want to pronounce it. It is a surprisingly rare weapon when trying to research more about it, but overall I think they stayed true to design and it looks great. Oh, also they have throwing axes and a two-handed sword. The only thing I can think of when it comes to Middle Ages and throwing axes would be the Franciscas, and that would at the latest put it in the 800s, and then when we think of the earliest longsword, we're somewhere maybe in the 13th century. So yeah, that part doesn't make much sense, but it does make a cool looking troop though. Once again, going back to the top, we are starting with the Vlandian infantry. Again, we have a fantastic use of the nasal helm. This one is a bit different than the one we saw before, as it has a slightly tilted forward tip known as the Phrygian cap design. Again, it's just amazing with the research that went into this game. We're also seeing that gambeson vest again along with those leather bracers, so not as great as some of the other ones we saw, but still pretty good, mostly due to how amazing the helmet is. This troop then splits into two different options, so we'll go with the cavalry option first. I know there are a lot of variable troop upgrades, but that's also what kind of makes this game so good. So starting with the cavalry option, we have the Vlandian light cavalry. Honestly, this might be the worst one just due to how odd that armor looks. It looks like it's some sort of leather knockoff armor that you would buy on Amazon. The idea of full leather chest armor is contentious to say the least, but I can guarantee you that it was never this. That leather doesn't even look like the proper thickness to stop anything. Even with that aside, there are massive gaps in the armor that leave certain areas just completely exposed, including certain parts of the shoulder which contain vital arteries. Definitely not the strongest looking troop that you have available. On the bright side, we have a skull cap with a nose guard, which is definitely cool to see. And we do have a bit of mail on the boots as well, so it's not entirely bad. After that, we have the final cavalry option, which is the Vlandian Vanguard, and it's insane how much of a difference one troop upgrade makes. So now we have not just proper chainmail to protect the torso, but we also have a full-on coat of plates as well. This is just fantastic armor that also fits into the 12th century armor that we have. Even though it would be very much the late 12th century, this is also a top tier troop, so it makes a little bit of sense. Another really great thing we see is the other type of chainmail boot. Both the style with the wrapping around and this version both work, but this version is seen as a more advanced version, as it's what we would see in later centuries, especially during the Crusader eras. Again, it should be going up the thigh as well, and then attached to some arming point at the pelvic area. Since this is a cavalry unit, this troop gets a horse, and it's interesting to see the full chainmail barding on this horse. It's done very historically accurately to my knowledge, although to be fair, I don't particularly know that much about horse armor. What I do know is it is a bit of a 13th century piece of equipment to have, but considering that this is again supposed to be a high status troop, I can see that he might just have the latest and greatest gear. Finally, the one thing that really stumped me is the helmet. I swear it looks familiar, but I can't for the life of me figure out what it is. The in-game name for the item is called the plated helmet, but even that item doesn't come with a scaled bever and the, what I can assume, coat of plates that goes around the sides. If you have any sources like manuscripts or museum finds that resemble this helmet, go ahead and feel free to share them with me, as I'd love to see them. Back to the top, again, we now have the Vlandian swordman. This one is great as well. We have the padded mittens, the short sleeve chainmail hauberk, the nasal helm servilier, the wrapped chainmail boots, and even a kite shield. This is probably the closest we'll come to our proto-Norman knight that we get from the infantry line. Can't really complain. Okay, I have one small thing. I could have mentioned it before, but it seems almost worse here somehow. But the sword on his hip isn't taking advantage of how the sword strap is meant to be used. It's way too far behind him, almost on his butt. It looks just weird. Next, we have one of my favorite troop types in the whole game, and that's the Vlandian sergeant. This unit is covered from head to toe in mail, and even has an enclosed helm that is like that of the early Knights Templars. The design of the helm is fantastic, and it even has the bulged out front that we see on examples of enclosed helms. The overall design of this troop is fantastic, and the only thing I could suggest to make it better would be to add chainmail underneath the helmet instead of just leaving it with a padded coif. Another small thing would be to remove those shoulder pauldron things. You could argue that they are ailets, but they don't particularly look like them to my knowledge. I mean, regardless, this troop looks menacing and I love it. Truly fantastic design work. Bonus content, because I like making my videos longer than they need to be, there's a type of troop that in rare cases spawns at certain villages and settlements, and to my knowledge each faction has one of them, and I'm fairly certain they are all cavalry units. In Vlandia's case, it's the Vlandian Squire and its upgrades, so let's take a quick look at those just because there's a lot of great stuff to look at there. Starting with the Vlandian Squire, of course, we have the basic peasant getup, which isn't that much new, but we do have a new type of headgear. It appears to be some type of mail coif that they even went the extra distance to add what looks like an attached mail ventail, or it might even be a bever, to the coif itself. Now that is a detail that very few people will appreciate, and I can't praise these developers enough for it. Besides that, I like that the little spike club that looks like a morning star. I don't know if wooden club morning stars were a thing, but I could see that being plausible, I guess. Next, we have the Vlandian Gallant. This is again going to be more of the same stuff we've seen before. The nasal helm looks like one of the few that actually have some chainmail attached to it though, so that's nice. The padded mittens also have some sort of reinforcement plates on them. Considering how small the plates are and how much of exposed mitten there still is left, it seems quite trivial in my opinion, but I suppose it's better than nothing. Moving on, we have the Vlandian Knight, and this I would say is peak Norman Knight. Chainmail head to toe with a nasal helm as well, no tabard, surcoat, or what have you, and that's also important because if we look at the Bayeux Tapestry, the depictions of Normans had exposed mail like this. They also had spears, kite shields, and horses like this as well. Well, maybe not horses like this, as this horse has a full chainmail barding, but you get the point. This is another really good looking troop in my opinion. Finally, we have the Vlandian Champion. This one is quite interesting due to the choice of adding all the best armor in the game, giving the knight the visored helm, and then calling this troop the Champion. If I had to guess, I would think that this is their interpretation of a medieval jouster using what resources they had to make this. Now, jousting itself, when brought up as a tournament sport, wasn't really introduced until the 14th century. I don't think that that's a big issue though. I think this looks great and it fits well with the final troop upgrade to get for these troops. Alright, I think that's going to be it. I hope you enjoyed a look into just a little bit of history behind the new Mount & Blade game. I'm no certified historian or anything, so I hope I didn't scuff this too hard. If you guys like this video, hitting the like button would be much appreciated. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or things you would like to see added into Bannerlord, go ahead and leave it down below. As always, thank you for watching and I hope you have a great day. Peace.